In Voltaire's novel Candide, there is a shipwreck in which Candide and Pangloss and their friend Jacques are shipwrecked in the harbour of Lisbon just before the Great Lisbon earthquake. And Jacques drowns. And Candide is upset about this, but Pangloss explains that you don't need to be upset, because Lisbon harbour was created in order for Jacques to drown. The 1755 earthquake at Lisbon had a huge impact on Voltaire, because he saw people argue that there must be a purpose in something like an earthquake. Else why would it happen? And that what the purpose must be to punish Lisbon for its sins. He wrote in his poem, was then more vice in fallen Lisbon found than Paris where voluptuous joys abound. He was attacking the philosophy of theodicy, Leibniz's idea that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. And Voltaire points out, with this satire in Candide, the kind of muddle you get into if you look for purpose in everything in the world. So why do we think there is a purpose? Because there is a pattern. And I think we've been misled into mistaking a pattern for a purpose. We don't have good words to describe how this pattern comes about, so we get into a verbal confusion trying to understand it. But it's clear that things have function in the world. It's clear that our brains are for thinking, and it's clear that there is progress. There is progress in evolution. We see larger and larger animals and more complicated structures appearing on the Earth. It gets set back by disasters, but then again you get a gradual incremental improvement in the way that life operates, and so that a creature would defeat its ancestor of 1 million years before. And you see the same in economics. You see the same in human society. We are experiencing progress. Technology is advancing. In my lifetime, smallpox has been extinguished, and the cell phone has been invented. In my lifetime, the living standard of the average person on the planet has trebled, the income of that person. Child mortality is down by 2/3. So there is an arrow, there is a direction, but there is not a destination, because these directions could go in almost any direction. You could throw them off into any way. And how does this come about? Well, it comes about through a bottom-up process. It's not a top-down process. We've made that discovery. Adam Smith and Charles Darwin and people like that stumbled upon this idea at the end of the Enlightenment, that it is possible to have order without ordaining it, that it is possible to have, in a phrase, emergent order. And it's one of the most beautiful ideas that human beings have ever come up with. And just as we embrace the idea that we can have an ordered society without having an absolute monarchy, that democracy can work, we didn't used to think that in the 17th century, we do think that now, so I think we should learn to embrace the idea of emergent order rather than top-down design. The idea that as people interact together, and as life interacts, as genes interact, you can get patterns emerging which are fascinating and which solve problems and which produce functional order and symmetry and beauty and all these other wonderful things we see in the world. But there is nobody in charge of the process, and there is no destination. It's a wonderful journey, and we don't know where it'll take us. Thank you very much.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this debate on one of life's most important questions. Does the universe have a purpose? And in today's debate, we on the affirmative side are going to defend two main contentions. First, that if God does not exist, then the universe has no purpose. And secondly, if God does exist, then the universe does have a purpose. Let me say a word in defense of each of those contentions. First, if God does not exist, then both man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. Man, like all biological organisms, must die. And the universe, too, faces a death of its own. Astronomers tell us that the universe is expanding, and as it does so, it grows colder and colder as its energy is used up. Eventually, all the stars will burn out, and all matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes. There will be no light, there will be no heat, there will be no life, just the corpses of dead stars and galaxies, ever expanding into the endless darkness and the cold recesses of space, a universe in ruins. This is not science fiction. As unimaginable as it may sound, barring divine intervention, this will happen. There is no escape. There is no hope. On atheism, there is no immortality beyond the grave. And what's the consequence of this? Well, as many atheist philosophers from Nietzsche to Russell to Sartre have recognized, it means that life itself is absurd. It means that life is without objective purpose. As Richard Dawkins has put it, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no good, no evil, nothing but pitiless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. Thus, if God does not exist, then life and the universe are without purpose. But if atheism fails to provide a purpose for life and the universe, what about biblical theism? According to the biblical worldview, God does exist and man's life does not end at the grave. The purpose of life is to be found in a personal relationship with a holy and loving God. As the Westminster Catechism asks, what is the chief end of man? To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Biblical theism thus provides the two conditions necessary for an objectively purposeful life: God and immortality. And because of this, we can live consistently and purposefully within the framework of such a worldview. And thus, biblical theism succeeds precisely where atheism breaks down. Now, I'd be the first to say that none of this proves that God exists. But in today's debate, we've been asked to discuss not whether God exists, but whether the universe has a purpose. And the answer to that question is, it all depends. If God does not exist, then the universe has no purpose. If God does exist, then the universe has a purpose. On this question, there need be no dispute between the theist and the atheist. I think we can all agree with those two contentions as I've stated them. Now, if our colleagues on the other side want to go beyond this merely conditional statement and claim that the universe in fact has no purpose, then they must prove that the antecedent of that conditional is true. That is to say, they must show that God does not exist. So what arguments did Professor Ridley give to show that God does not exist? Well, I basically heard only one, namely the problem of evil. This is not the best of all possible worlds. Well, certainly all of us need to face the problem of evil, and any account of evil must begin with this question: what is evil? I maintain that evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. I can think of no more reasonable definition of evil that captures our shared intuitions. But if we agree that there is evil in the world, and that evil is a departure from the way things ought to be, then we must also agree that there is a way things ought to be. But if there is a way things ought to be, then there must be some transcendent design plan or purpose that determines how things ought to be. And so there must be some transcendent being, a creator in fact, whose will is the basis for how things ought to be. And hence evil is actually evidence that God does exist. If atheists are right and God does not exist, then there is no design plan, hence no way things ought to be, hence no departure from the way things ought to be, and hence no evil. But does anyone here really want to claim that evil does not exist? So I don't think we've heard any good reason to think that God does not exist. Indeed, the theist is not committed to Leibniz's claim that this is the best of all possible worlds. Now, time doesn't permit me to develop in my opening statement a case for theism. Let me simply list the arguments which I have defended in my published work. Number one, God is the best explanation for why anything exists rather than nothing. 2, God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. 3, God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe for intelligent life. 4, God is the best explanation for the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world, including evil. And 5, the very possibility of God's existence entails that God exists. If you're interested in a detailed discussion of these arguments,
time is out. I'm sorry.
See my book, Reasonable Faith.
Thank you very much. Good morning. As Thomas Huxley said, Richard, the good Lord has delivered them into our hands. I am the publisher of this magazine, Skeptic Magazine. By chance, and that's all it is, our latest issue is on the pseudoscience and nonsense of the whole happiness purpose movement. That is, once you believe that the universe somehow has a design purpose for us and us alone, that I can have anything I want, all I have to do is wish it, pray for it, ask for it, and it will appear. The Mercedes in my driveway, the healing of my aunt's cancer, or miracles to appear upon my wish. That's just pure nonsense. There is not a shred of evidence that any of this is actually true. It's wishful thinking. And that's the problem of thinking that the universe has some design just for us. However, I'm a scientist. I'm willing to look at new data, some evidence. So here's an example, guys. If you could have God grow some new limbs of amputees of soldiers in the Iraq War, Christian soldiers with Christian families praying for them to be healed, I would seriously consider that and changing my mind. So far, this has not happened, not even once. Apparently, God can't even do what amphibians can do in growing new limbs. If there's a purpose, surely we would see at least one sign like this, and yet we have zero. Okay, so then what is our purpose? We come from stardust. All of the elements of which we are made out of were cooked inside stars, coalesced into new solar systems like ours, and here we are, complex organisms. For 3.5 billion years, life has evolved from one generation to the next, not one broken chain in this long link. Darwin said, instead of finding this to be depressing, as our opponents think this is a grim worldview, in fact, it's an ennobling worldview. Darwin said, when I view all beings not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long ago, they seem to me to become ennobled. It's ennobling to think how fortunate we are to be part of that 3.5 billion year long chain. We are an integral link in that. What could be more uplifting than that? But there goes more than that. We have big brains. We do many different things to contribute to this lineal descent of getting our genes into the next generation. And in fact, there's a science that studies this. That is what makes people happy, fulfilled, and feeling like they have purpose. There are 4 things you can do. 1, deep love, family commitment, commitment to another person. Even a person of the same gender, by the way. And that's okay. Thank you. I don't know if this is an issue in Mexico, but it's a big issue in the United States. To think that you would condemn somebody for their nature and deny them the opportunity for deep love and marriage just because they're different from you. How unchristian is that? And yet that is the position they take. Two, meaningful work and career. That is, doing something productive. Makes people feel fulfilled, happy, and have a sense of purpose. Not just to make money, but to actually do something in the world that makes a difference. 3, we're a social primate species. How we interact with other people matters. So the third thing you can do is be involved socially, politically, in your community. Not just your family and your extended family, but people you don't know, strangers, manning the soup kitchen, volunteering for nonprofits, helping other people in some way. This is one of the most important things that people report makes them feel better, happy, fulfilled, giving deep purpose in their life. And finally, 4, some sense of transcendency, something beyond you. Now, religion claims this as their monopoly, their exclusive rights to the idea of being spiritually fulfilled. This is nonsense. The religious worldview is so small, so medieval in its just tiny little proscenium right here, the stage on earth of which we're acting out this drama just for some grand life to come. No, that's not what counts. What counts is the here and now. If there is no afterlife, if there is no God, how important it is now what you do. Now is what it counts. Your relationships with other people now is what counts and matters. Not so you can chalk up some points for the next life, to get a bonus and move up the ranks into some special country club on high. No, what you do now matters. And I will finish mine with a quote from Helen Keller. Most of you probably know Helen Keller, who was blind, deaf, and dumb, 1930s, who found deep significance, wrote, "I know no study that will take you nearer the way to happiness than the study of nature. And I include in the study of nature not only things and their forces, but mankind and their ways. And the molding of the affections and the will into an earnest desire, not only to be happy, but to create happiness. And it all comes down to this: the simplest way to be happy is to do good. Do good."
I think that it is wonderful and intriguing that we have such tremendous, brilliant energy, all devoted to explaining why we have no purpose. And I want to present the possibility that we do. First of all, not only because this world, this universe, because remember, the question is not do you have a purpose, but does the universe have a purpose? Not only because this universe is balanced on a knife edge. There are all the cosmological constants, which if you changed even by a fraction, would plunge us into darkness forever. Not only because the universe is so finely tuned and finely designed, but because all of you, all of us, have inside of us this remarkable mechanism that is able to comprehend the mechanisms of the universe. Because you can, with your mind, embrace that which is larger than you, than your life, than this world. Because your mind can actually discover the laws that operate the universe. Steven Weinberg, the physicist who would be sitting on this side of the table or of the boxing ring were he here, said, the more we comprehend the universe, the more meaningless it seems. But of course, that's almost a contradiction, because you can't comprehend it if it's meaningless. Nonsense can't be comprehended. Only meaning and order and purpose can be understood. And the very endeavor of science is about the idea that the world is about something. If it's not about anything, then how could we study it? How could we understand it? And that leads, of course, to the third point. In addition to the fact that the world is fine-tuned, that we can understand it, it is that the world operates according to laws. And that's an astonishing thing that we are so used to that we don't realize how amazing it is that the world operates according to fixed laws. That alone should awaken our wonder. And wonder is a critical part of what we have to understand about this debate. Yesterday, we heard an erudite, entertaining, and combative talk from Professor Dawkins that proved that religion does not work according to the canons of science. And Michael Shermer got up and said, where is the evidence? If you would regrow a limb, I would believe it, as though, again, religion is supposed to operate like science. But I want to remind you that science is not the only mode of knowing. It's not the only paradigm for understanding. In fact, everybody here, in that which matters most to you in your life, relies on something other than science. Why do you get up in the morning? Is life worth living? Whom do you choose to love? And why do you believe love matters? Those are not scientific questions, and yet you live your life by those questions. We shouldn't think that if you can't put it in a test tube, or you can't see it in a microscope, or you can't spot it in a telescope, then it doesn't matter and it doesn't exist. We live our lives by intangibles, by poetry, by love, by dreams, by aspiration, and these things are not susceptible to repeat experiments to disproof. When we talk about whether the universe has a purpose, you can't locate that simply by doing astrophysical experiments, that's not how you find whether the universe has a purpose. Now, you might say the universe has a purpose the way the kitchen has a meal. That is, it contains all the ingredients you need. But we're not asking if the universe has purposes. We agree to that. We're asking whether the universe has a purpose. And as my colleague said, in order to believe that, you have to believe that the universe has a purposer, somebody who generates that purpose. And we may not know what the purpose is, and we may never understand it. But remember, experiments are not the only ways of understanding. And here, I want to take the motto of this conference, and I want to extend it a little bit and suggest to you that you consider it carefully. The motto of the conference is, don't believe everything you think. And I think that makes sense, because sometimes, just sometimes, about the central questions of life, you should believe what you believe. Thank you.
My colleague Peter Atkins, whose works I recommend to you, I think that it's high time that a scientist won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and Peter Atkins would be my nominee for that. He was once invited to give a lecture in Windsor Castle, which, as you know, is one of the homes of the British monarch. And at the end of his lecture, Prince Philip said, "You scientists are awfully good at answering the how questions, but what about the why question?" And Peter Atkins said, "Sir, the why question is just a silly question." We humans are obsessed with purpose. It seems perfectly natural when we're presented with an object to say, what's it for? It starts in childhood. The psychologist Deborah Kellerman has investigated this very interestingly with children, offering them a question like, why do you think these rocks are pointy? Is it because of some geological explanation, geological cause, or is it so that animals could scratch on them when they get itchy? And below a certain age, I think it's about 6, most children answer with the teleological answer with the purpose question. Yes, they're pointy so that animals can scratch on them when they get itchy. Children then mostly grow out of that purposive way of looking at the world, but not apparently everybody. In medieval times, I was about to try to work this. Who's good with iPads? I'm trying to get... Oh, here we are. Okay. In medieval times, divines would look at living things and see purpose for human benefit in them. In the 19th century, the Reverend William Paley thought that the louse was an indispensable incentive to cleanliness. Savage beasts, according to an Elizabethan bishop, fostered human courage and provided useful training for war. Horseflies, for an 18th century writer, were created so that men should exercise their wits and industry to guard themselves against them. Lobsters were given hard shells so that before eating them we could benefit from the improving exercise of cracking their claws. Another medieval writer thought that weeds were there to benefit us. It's so good for our spirit to have to work hard pulling them up. Now, it's not difficult to see that such people would also have found purpose in the physical world, in mountains. What's the purpose of a mountain? What's the purpose of a stream? We humans love to see purpose everywhere. And it's one of the great achievements of science, I think especially Darwin, but other scientists as well, to show that the impulse that we have to see purpose in anything doesn't work. And he did it not with the easy things like mountains. I mean, essentially any fool could see that mountains don't have a purpose. He did it with living things. And living things on the face of it have purpose written all over them. We look at a bird's wing, an engineer looks at a bird's wing, an albatross wing, say, and sees that it's perfectly designed for the particular way of flying that albatrosses have. Swifts have a different way. You look at an eye, you look at a heart, you look at a kidney. Everything looks designed. The Reverend William Paley himself, who was one of the earliest, one of the most coherent, I should say, advocates of this point of view, elevated the living world as being the most important place where you can find evidence for, as he thought, a deity. Don't look at astronomy, he said, look at living things. But what Darwin did was to show that even the worst case, even the most difficult case, that's the living case, has a perfectly rational, simple explanation. You do not need to resort to the idea of a designer. That was an astonishing intellectual achievement. Something as complicated as an eye, something as complicated as a heart, even a brain. Who would have thought that by the laws of physics, unaided, unviolated, just filtered through this brilliant process of natural selection, evolution by natural selection, that the blind laws of physics could produce the illusion of design as complicated and as persuasive as we see in the living world? Well, our colleagues on the other side have probably mostly given up on the living world. That was their happy hunting ground. That was the best place for them to operate, as Paley recognized. So they've been forced back now into places like the origin of the cosmos, the origin of the universe. And they like to point to the origin of the universe and say, well, science can't explain the Big Bang, or science can't explain where the laws of physics come from. Physicists are working on that. That's what scientists do. They don't lie down and pathetically say, oh, we don't understand it, so God did it. Scientists actually work on the problem. They set to work, they roll up their sleeves, and they work on the problem. One day, physics will answer those deep questions. And even if it doesn't, even if physics doesn't answer those questions, what on earth makes you think that religion can? Thank you very much.
Y buenos días, Puebla. Me da mucho gusto estar aquí con ustedes, platicando en poquito español y participando en este debate. Prefiero hablar en español, pero es mejor para todos nosotros si hablo inglés. Buenos, empiezo en inglés. The three of us here hold that life and the universe do have a purpose, but only if God exists. Recall the two contentions that William Lane Craig mentioned in his presentation. Number one, if God does not exist, then the universe has no purpose. And two, if God does exist, then the universe does have a purpose. He spoke of this God as the God of biblical monotheism for a reason, and that is that this God is a God who does more than exist. The God of biblical theism purposefully created the universe. This God also created human persons in the divine image. And so God has endowed human beings with certain properties and capacities, including rationality, demonstrated here today, consciousness, felt by each one of you, capacities for interpersonal relationship, moral responsibility, and freedom of self-determination. You are free to choose whether to be here today or not. And God continues to be personally interested in the lives of all individuals, whether or not they believe in God. But God has made special provision for loving relationship with those who endeavor to please God by doing God's will. Cheerful obedience to the loving will of God fulfills the highest ideal of living a purposeful, meaningful, deeply fulfilling life. Now, our colleagues here may agree with our two main contentions. If they agree, though, with these two claims, then presumably they believe that the universe has no purpose. And so it seems from the things that they've said in their opening statements. And this because they believe that God does not exist. But let's suppose that they disagree with our first contention and that they hold that life and the universe do have a purpose, even if God does not exist. Like us, they need to say something about what this purpose is. And Michael Shermer attempted to say that, but of course, many of the practical suggestions that he gave about how to live our lives for purposeful aims are things that theists and atheists can agree to. I would like to know what is distinctive about the atheistic point of view. If the universe exists by accident, then there is no intention behind the origin of the universe. Apparent design in the universe is a bizarre figment. And it would be a bizarre figment for it to be so apparently designed and yet not really designed, as Richard Dawkins thinks. The universe is not moving toward any goal, and neither is human behavior or human history. Stuff happens, and that's about it. There is no real ideal pattern for human behavior in the good life, nothing ultimate and transcendent that gives us a lodestar for how we should pursue things that matter. Personal meaning is really whatever you can make of it artificially, if you can do anything about it at all. Now, if any of those on this side believes that life in the universe has a purpose, that purpose, I believe, rests entirely on an arbitrary existential choice at best. Now, the irony of this leads us to evidence that God exists, because this choice that we might make without the idea of God for a meaningful existence is only possible because we are endowed by God with a capacity of self-determination. They can't explain why we experience freedom and are capable of planning and developing projects and following our aspirations without reference to a personal God who has endowed us with that freedom. So any arbitrary existential choice about the purpose of life, if it really is a choice, depends ultimately on the existence of a freedom-bestowing God. And if this is true, then a choice that denies God is a choice for what you might call an absurdly meaningful life. The meaning of any life that rejects God and God's loving will is a form of rebellion against ultimate purpose. For some, in fact, meaning is found in defying God by not believing in God. What about the case for God's existence then? The evidence is rich and complex, and I as well have written in detail about this. But this morning, I wish to point out that our collective interest in this question, the whole point of the conference centering around purpose, does the universe have purpose, is itself a signpost for the existence of God. To be concerned with a question like this, we have to be creatures of a certain kind. A naturalistic, evolutionary account of human existence and human nature, it seems, cannot explain the capacities we have as creatures to take seriously this problem of human purpose. If we were nothing but stardust or an accidental collocation of atoms, as Bertrand Russell said, there would be no question of human purpose and no problem of human meaning, and then no point in this conference. Thank you. Y gracias.
As I look at my notes for the debate this afternoon, I think there's wide agreement among us on the two contentions that we said we would defend. First, that if God does not exist, then there is no purpose for the universe, and our colleagues seem to agree with that. Secondly, on the other hand, if the God of biblical theism does exist, then clearly there is a purpose for universe and for life, and that's found in relationship with God. The question then is, have the two sides presented arguments and evidence for or against the existence of God? Now, so far as I can see, all I've heard from the atheist side is the argument from evil, which I answered and has yet to be replied to. We heard an argument from evolutionary development, but that obviously doesn't prove that God is not the supervisor who created life through evolution. That doesn't in any way prove atheism. I haven't seen any other argument for atheism in tonight's debate. So while we can agree that if God does not exist, life has no purpose, we've not heard any good or compelling evidence for the antecedent of that conditional, that God does not exist. By contrast, I think we've heard 10 arguments that I list for the existence of God. The argument from why anything exists rather than nothing, the argument from the beginning of the universe, the argument from the fine-tuning of the universe for life, the argument from objective moral values, the argument from the possibility of God's existence. David Wolpe's argument from the comprehensibility of the universe. Number 8, the argument from the law-like structure of the universe. Number 9, Doug Guyvet's argument from the nature of existential choice. And finally, number 10, the very nature of human beings is capable of asking questions of purpose. All of these, I think, constitute a powerful cumulative case for thinking that there is a transcendent creator and designer of the universe who is the locus of absolute moral goodness, and in relationship with whom we can find the purpose and meaning of the universe. I think the most reprehensible position represented in tonight's debate is Richard Dawkins' claim that why questions are just silly. These are the deepest existential questions that human beings can ask, and to refuse to ask such why questions is to reduce human being to mere animals, which is, of course, exactly what Professor Dawkins believes. We're just animated chunks of matter in motion. Love, questions of meaning, and so forth are all ultimately just spin-offs of the blind bioevolutionary process. But if God exists, then clearly these are meaningful questions. These are vital questions for the nature of human existence and destiny. The tragedy would be that if God does exist and you miss his purpose for your life because you think these are silly questions and therefore don't need to think about them, would be the ultimate tragedy.
I'm only hearing straw men. I'm hearing that there's wide agreement that God, if the universe is not to have a purpose, then it must mean that God doesn't exist. But I think the universe doesn't have a purpose, not because I think God doesn't exist, but because I look at the universe and conclude that the universe doesn't have a purpose. It's nothing to do with whether God exists or not. We can go on to discuss that as well, but it's not. It's simply wrong to say that we've agreed that the universe will have a purpose if God exists. And I've also heard it said that it's not possible to live a fulfilling life without a freedom-bestowing God. Well, I think that's a terrible mistake. There are lots of us who live extremely fulfilling lives with a wonderfully purposeful experience, in which we do our own purposes, but that doesn't mean the universe has a purpose, and it doesn't mean that there's a freedom-bestowing God. I've heard it's a bizarre figment that things seem to have a purpose, that there is function and order in the world. I don't think it's a bizarre figment at all. I think we've amply demonstrated that it's quite possible to have order and pattern and complexity in the world without there being a destination and without there being a top-down designer. And we've heard from Rabbi Wolpe that people live their lives by things other than science. And rightly so, of course they do. But that doesn't mean that we can find in that other than science the definition of God. That's the God of the gaps. I mean, I could just as easily say the great spaghetti monster therefore exists because you live your life by more than science. The search for the purpose in life is a bit like the search for the secret of life itself, which theology thought it had a stranglehold on for many centuries. And then as science began to investigate, first of all, it fell back to saying, well, yes, there's special chemicals for life, but then they synthesized urea, and that argument went out the window. So then they said, well, there's going to be special protoplasm. There's something mystical and irreducible in living organisms that is not present in non-living. And then we found that a very simple chemical called DNA actually explained everything we needed to explain. And then we said, well, the genetic code is going to be very special. It's going to have unusual features that we will never be able to understand, but it turned out to be a simple linear digital recombination. And then we found that the genetic code was a frozen accident. And then we looked for special human genes, and we didn't find them. We found we've got the same 21,000 genes as a mouse. We just use them in a different pattern and a different order. So I think the search for a purpose in life